Two orphaned brothers find a wounded and abandoned woman behind the cemetery, where they just buried their own mother. As they take her in, they discover she was betrayed by her own children and left for dead. Unknowingly, the boys spark a fight for justice that will rock the entire small town. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. Havenwood, Vermont, was waking up slowly that June morning, wrapped in a thick fog that rose from the valley and covered the colonial churches like a mysterious veil. The cobblestone streets still held the night's dew, and the bell of St. Francis of Assisi Church echoed alone, marking 6 in the morning with its deep, melancholic voice. In the small clapboard house in the lowlands neighborhood, Matthew and Michael were awake even before the bell rang. The 12-year-old twins had been light sleepers ever since their mother passed away 3 months ago, taken by an illness that slowly consumed her strength. Now they lived with their grandmother, Betty, a woman in her early 60s with hands calloused from years of taking in laundry for other families, but with an immense heart that embraced her grandsons with the force of someone who refuses to let sadness win. Matthew was the quieter of the two. He had deep-set eyes as if he were always thinking of something far away, and he carried an old notebook under his arm wherever he went. He wrote things he never showed anyone, words only he understood, trying to make sense of a world that seemed so unfair. Michael, on the other hand, was the one who moved, who talked, who tried to keep life in motion. He helped his grandmother with chores, carried the bundles of clean laundry back to the ladies she worked for, and always tried to coax a smile out of his brother. That morning, Grandma Betty woke them with a voice that was soft but firm. Today was the day to take flowers to their mother's grave. It was a ritual she insisted on maintaining, not out of obligation, but out of love and respect. The boys got ready in silence, putting on the mended shirts their grandmother had ironed the night before, and walked together through the still deserted streets of Havenwood. The cemetery was on the high side of town, in a place where the wind blew strong and the view stretched to the hills covered in the dense Vermont woods. It was a beautiful place in its own way, but also melancholic, the iron crosses and marble headstones mixed with simple white-painted brick graves. The fog made everything feel even more unreal, as if this were a place between the world of the living and the world of memories. The boys walked side by side, each carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers their grandmother had picked from her yard. There were daisies, black-eyed Susans, and a few rosebuds that stubbornly bloomed even in the cool mountain air. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of those who share the same pain and need no words to understand each other. When they reached their mother's grave, a simple concrete plot with a wooden cross where her name was hand-carved, Matthew knelt and placed the flowers carefully. Michael stood, holding his brother's hand, and murmured a prayer his grandmother had taught them. It wasn't a memorized prayer from a book, but simple words asking for protection, for strength, asking that their mother be at peace wherever she was. They stayed there for a few minutes in silence, until the morning chill began to bite, and Michael gently nudged his brother, signaling it was time to go. Matthew nodded, wiped away the tears that insisted on falling, and the two began to walk down the stone path that led to the cemetery's iron gate. That's when they heard it. A low moan, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere near the stone wall that separated the cemetery from the thick woods. Matthew stopped first, frowning and looking around. Michael heard it too and turned toward the sound. At first they thought it was the wind, but the moan repeated, clearer this time, filled with pain and desperation. The boys looked at each other, hesitant. That part of the cemetery was avoided by the locals. They said it was haunted, that strange things happened there, that it was best not to go near it after the sun went down. But it was morning, and curiosity, mixed with an unease neither of them could explain, made them head toward the sound. They stepped carefully between the oldest graves, some covered in moss and ivy, others completely abandoned, with no name, no flowers, no one to remember them. The moan grew louder, and then, as they rounded a stone mausoleum cracked by time, they saw her. A woman, elderly, lying on the damp ground, among dry leaves and twisted branches. Her clothes were torn, her face bruised, her wrists and ankles bearing deep marks from ropes that were still tied around them, loose as if someone had tried to free her in a hurry and given up. Her white hair was matted with dirt, and she was shivering, her eyes half closed, barely conscious. Matthew's heart pounded. Michael took a step back, startled, but then came forward again, pulling his brother by the shirt sleeve. "What do we do?" Michael asked, his voice trembling. Matthew didn't answer right away. He stared at the woman, at the state she was in, and felt a mix of fear and compassion that tightened his chest. This woman needed help. It didn't matter who she was or how she got there. She was suffering, and they couldn't just walk away and pretend they hadn't seen anything. "We're going to help," Matthew said, his voice firm despite his fear. Michael agreed, and the two approached slowly. Matthew knelt beside the woman and began to untie the ropes, still binding her wrists. His hands were shaking, but he didn't stop. Michael ran to the cemetery gate where there was a water spigot and came back with the water bottle they had brought, offering it to the elderly woman's chapped lips. She drank slowly, choking a little, but managed a few sips. When she opened her eyes fully, she looked at the boys with an expression of disbelief and gratitude. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a hoarse, incomprehensible whisper. "You're hurt, ma'am," Michael said gently. "We need to get you somewhere. To a hospital, maybe." The woman shook her head weakly, as if trying to say something, but she had no strength. Matthew looked at his brother, and they both knew they couldn't take her to the hospital alone. They had no money for a ride, and the woman was too weak to walk. The only option was to take her to the person they trusted most in the world. "Let's take her to Grandma's house," Matthew said. "Grandma will know what to do." Michael agreed, and together they tried to help the woman to her feet. She was light, almost frail, but still too heavy for two 12-year-old boys. They decided to take turns, one supporting her by the shoulders, while the other held her legs. It was difficult, slow, and they had to stop to rest several times. But they didn't give up. The walk back to Grandma Betty's house was long. The streets of Havenwood were busier now, and some people stopped to stare, curious and suspicious. But no one offered to help. No one asked what was happening. It was as if the boy's poverty and the woman's condition were reason enough to turn away and keep walking. When they finally reached the house, panting and exhausted, Grandma Betty was in the backyard, hanging clothes on the line. Seeing her grandsons carrying a strange woman, she dropped everything and ran to them, her eyes wide with concern. "Oh, my lord, what happened?" she asked, helping the boys support the woman. "We found her in the cemetery, Grandma," Michael explained, still out of breath. "She was tied up, hurt. We couldn't just leave her there." Betty looked at the woman, at the marks on her face, at her torn clothes, and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Without another question, she guided the boys inside, and together they laid the elderly woman on the only available mattress in the small back room. With firm, careful hands, Betty began to clean the woman's wounds. She used warm water, clean cloths, and a little rubbing alcohol she kept for emergencies. The boys stood in the doorway, watching in silence, still processing what had happened. The woman moaned softly as Betty cleaned a deeper cut on her forehead. But she didn't complain. When the wounds were clean and covered with makeshift bandages, Betty made a calming herbal tea and helped the woman drink it. Slowly, the elderly woman began to regain some of her strength. She was silent for a while, just breathing slowly, her eyes closed as if gathering the courage to speak. Betty sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting in her lap, waiting patiently. The boys waited too, sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall. Finally, the woman opened her eyes and looked at Betty. Her voice was weak but filled with emotion. "Thank you, you saved my life." Betty smiled faintly, but her eyes were worried. "You need a doctor. I'm going to call someone." The woman shook her head, grabbing Betty's hand with surprising strength. "No, please, don't call the police. Not yet. I need to tell you what happened first. I need someone to know the truth." Betty frowned but didn't insist. There was something in the woman's voice, an urgency, a fear, that made her realize this story was more complicated than it seemed. "Then tell us," Betty said calmly. "We're here to listen." The woman closed her eyes again, and when she opened them they were filled with tears. "My name is Helen Carter, and I was betrayed by my own children." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with expectation. The boys moved closer, sitting on the floor beside the bed. Betty squeezed Helen's hand, encouraging her to continue. Helen took a deep breath and began her story. She said she had been a widow for 10 years, that she had 3 children, and that over the past few months she had noticed something was wrong. Her children, who had always been distant, started visiting more often. At first she thought it was belated affection, a desire to be closer, but she soon realized their interest was something else entirely. They wanted her to sign papers. They said it was to make things easier, to organize the inheritance, to make sure everything was settled when she was no longer around. Helen, who had always been a sharp and cautious woman, refused. She said she wouldn't sign anything without fully understanding what she was doing. That's when things changed. The children started treating her poorly, making cruel comments about her age, about her ability to care for herself. They said she was getting forgetful, that she was no longer fit to manage her own affairs. Helen knew it wasn't true, but she realized they were building a narrative, setting the stage for something worse. And then a few days ago they took her from her home. They said they were going to a quiet place where she could rest. Helen was suspicious, but she went. She thought that deep down she could still trust them. After all, they were her children. But on the way, they stopped in an isolated place, and that's where it all happened. Helen didn't want to go into detail about the violence she suffered, but the tears streaming down her face said everything. They told her she was useless, that she was a burden, that it would be better if she just disappeared. They tied her up and left her there in the cemetery, hidden among the abandoned graves, hoping no one would find her, or that if they did, it would be too late. But the boys had found her, and now she was here, alive, but terrified, because she knew her children wouldn't give up easily. They had plans, papers drawn up, and were probably already spreading the news that she had disappeared, maybe even inventing a story about mental problems or an accident. Betty listened to it all in silence, her expression grave. When Helen finished speaking, she held the woman's hands firmly and looked her in the eye. "You're safe here, no. One will hurt you while you're under my roof, but we need to be careful. People with power and money have ways of twisting the truth. We're going to need help." Helen nodded, exhausted. Betty stood up and asked the boys to come with her to the kitchen. There, away from Helen, she spoke in a low voice. "This is serious, boys, very serious. You did the right thing bringing this woman here, but now we have to think about what to do. If her children find out she's here, they might come after us. And it won't be easy." Matthew and Michael looked at each other, but there was no doubt in their eyes. They knew what had to be done. "We're not going to let them hurt her again," Matthew said, with a conviction that surprised even himself. "We were right to help, and we're going to keep helping." Betty smiled, proud of her grandsons. She ran a hand through each of their hair and nodded. "Then we'll need allies. I'm going to talk to Father John. He knows people who can help, and we'll keep this a secret for now. No one but the 3 of us, can know she's here." The days that followed were filled with a growing tension. Helen recovered slowly, but the shadow of fear never completely left her. Betty kept the woman hidden, preparing simple meals and making sure she had everything she needed to get stronger. Meanwhile, in town, rumors began to spread. They said a wealthy woman from Boston had disappeared, that her family was desperate, that they were offering a reward for any information. The talk spread quickly, and Betty knew it was only a matter of time before someone started asking more pointed questions. One afternoon, Matthew came, back from the farmer's market with a worried expression. He had overheard 2 women talking about the disappearance. They said the woman was confused, that she had mental problems, that she had probably wandered off and was in danger. The narrative was being carefully constructed, and it was convincing. Betty listened in silence and then went to the room where Helen was resting. She told her what was happening outside, and the woman's expression hardened. "They're doing exactly what I thought they would. They're painting me as a senile old woman who doesn't know what she's doing. And if they find me, they'll say they rescued me, that I'm delusional, that nothing I say is true." Betty crossed her arms, thinking, "Then we need to make sure that when they come, and they will come, we have proof. Witnesses. People who believe your word." Helen agreed, but the fear was still there, deeply rooted. Betty knew they had to act fast. The next morning, Betty went to St. Francis of Assisi Church and spoke with Father John, a middle-aged man with a gentle voice and a just heart. She told him Helen's story, leaving out no details, and asked for his help. Father John listened intently, and when Betty finished, he nodded slowly. "I know someone who can help, a social worker who deals with cases of elder abuse. I'll contact her, but we need to be quick. If this woman is telling the truth, and I believe she is, then we're dealing with something very serious." Betty thanked him and went home with a little more hope. But she knew the battle was just beginning. That same afternoon, as she was helping Helen sit in a kitchen chair for some tea, she heard a knock at the door. Her heart leaped. She looked at the boys, who also tensed up, and then walked slowly to the door. She opened it just a crack and saw a well-dressed man in a dark suit, tie, and polished shoes. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Good afternoon. I'm looking for a woman who disappeared a few days ago, a Mrs. Helen Carter. Have you by any chance seen or heard anything about her?" Betty's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "No, I haven't. Why would you think I would?" The man tilted his head slightly, the cold smile still in place. "I've heard you're known for helping people. I thought perhaps someone might have come to you. The family is very worried. Mrs. Carter isn't well mentally, you see. She needs care." Betty gripped the door tighter, but showed no hesitation. "If I hear anything, I'll let you know, but so far I haven't seen a thing." The man studied her for a moment too long, as if trying to read between the lines. Then, finally, he nodded and handed her a card. "If you do see or hear anything, please get in touch. The family would be very grateful." Betty took the card and slowly closed the door. As soon as the man was gone, she leaned her back against the door and let out the breath she'd been holding. Matthew and Michael appeared in the hallway, their eyes wide. "He knows," Matthew said. "He suspects something." Betty nodded, tucking the card into her apron pocket. "Yes, and now everything gets more complicated, but we're not backing down. We're going to protect Helen, no matter what it costs." And so, in that small house in the lowlands neighborhood of Havenwood, a silent battle began to take shape. On one side, an elderly woman betrayed by her own children. On the other, a grandmother and two orphan boys, armed only with compassion and courage. And between them, a truth that had to come out, no matter how many lies tried to smother it. The following days were marked by a tension that hung in the air like the very fog that blanketed Havenwood each morning. Betty kept to her usual routine, washing clothes, ironing, delivering the clean, fragrant bundles to her clients. But now every step outside the house was calculated. Every glance she received on the street seemed to carry a silent question, an unspoken suspicion. Helen was recovering slowly, at least physically. The bruises on her face began to fade, turning from deep purple to shades of yellow and green. The rope marks on her wrists and ankles were still there, deep, like scars that would take a long time to disappear. But what worried Betty most was the woman's emotional state. Helen had nightmares every night, waking with a start, her eyes wide, searching for someone or something that wasn't there. And when she woke, it took a few seconds for her to remember where she was, to realize she was safe. Matthew and Michael took turns keeping her company. Matthew, with his quiet demeanor, would sit by the bed and read aloud from the only book they owned, an old Bible that had belonged to their mother. They weren't exactly cheerful stories, but Helen seemed to find comfort in the words, in the boy's calm voice, in the silent presence that told her she wasn't alone. Michael, for his part, tried to draw a smile from her. He told funny stories about things that happened at school, about the neighbor's dog who was always escaping and coming back with chickens in its mouth, about the time he and Matthew tried to bake a cake and nearly set the kitchen on fire. Helen would laugh, a faint but genuine laugh, and it was like a balm for everyone in the house. It was on the third day after the visit from the man in the suit that Father John appeared, accompanied by a woman. She was tall, in her early 40s, with her hair in a neat bun, thin-framed glasses, and a serious but kind expression. She wore a white blouse and simple black pants, and carried a leather portfolio under her arm. "Betty, this is Laura Taylor," Father John introduced them. "She's a social worker who specializes in cases of domestic violence and elder abuse. I told her about Mrs. Carter's situation, and she offered to help." Laura extended her hand to Betty, who shook it firmly. There was something about the woman's posture that inspired confidence, a professional seriousness that wasn't cold. "I know this is a delicate situation," Laura said, entering the house with the priest, "but we need to proceed with caution. If Mrs. Carter was truly a victim of violence by her children, and everything points to that, then we're dealing with a serious case. And people with financial resources, as seems to be the case here, usually have lawyers, connections, influence. We need to build a solid case." Betty led them to the room where Helen was resting. The woman was sitting up in bed, her back propped against makeshift pillows, her trembling hands holding a cup of tea. When she saw Father John, she relaxed a little. But when her eyes met Laura's, there was hesitation. "Mrs. Carter," Father John said gently, "this is Laura. She's here to help you. You can trust her." Helen studied the social worker for a moment, then nodded slowly. Laura approached, pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. She opened her portfolio and took out a pen and a notepad. "Mrs. Carter, I need you to tell me everything that happened, from the beginning. I know it can be difficult to relive these memories, but it's important that I have all the details. I'll write everything down, and then we'll decide together what the next steps are. Are you okay with that?" Helen took a deep breath, looked at Betty, who gave her an encouraging nod, and then began to speak. She told the whole story again, but this time with more detail. She talked about how her children had started visiting more frequently months ago, always bringing papers for her to sign, always insisting it was for her own good, to make things easier. Helen owned a large property in Boston, as well as investments and some savings. She wasn't extremely wealthy, but she had enough to live comfortably and leave an inheritance. When she refused to sign the papers without fully understanding them, her children's attitude changed. They began to treat her with contempt, making comments about her age, about how she was becoming forgetful, confused. Helen knew she wasn't. She had always been a lucid, organized woman with a sharp mind. But her children wanted to plant the idea that she was losing her mental capacity, and they did it in front of neighbors, acquaintances, creating a narrative that could be used against her later. And then came the day they took her away. They said it was for an outing, to a quiet place where she could rest. Helen naively believed them. She still held out hope that deep down, her children cared for her. But when they stopped on an isolated road, far from everything, the truth came out. Here, Helen paused. Tears began to stream down her face, and she needed a few moments to compose herself. Laura didn't rush her. She waited patiently, jotting down what had already been said, giving the woman time to find the strength to continue. "They told me I was a burden, that I was useless, that it would be better if I just disappeared. And then they tied me up. I begged them. I told them, begged. They were my children, that I loved them, that I didn't understand why they were doing this, but they didn't listen, or they didn't want to. They brought me to that cemetery, threw me there like I was trash, and drove away." Helen's voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. Betty moved closer and put a hand on her shoulder, silent. Laura closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of those words, and then resumed writing. "Mrs. Carter, I need you to tell me your children's names, and if possible, any information about where they live, where they work, anything that might be useful." Helen nodded and provided the names. Charles, the eldest, a successful lawyer in Boston. Renee, the middle child, married to a businessman, living a comfortable life without needing to work. And Richard, the youngest, who ran a consulting business. All well established, all with resources, all with reputations to protect. Laura wrote it all down, then asked for permission to photograph the marks on Helen's body. The woman hesitated but agreed. Laura documented every bruise, every rope mark, every scratch with a small, discreet camera. It would all be used as evidence. Now, we need to think about your safety. If your children find out you're here, they might try something. I'm going to contact a trusted lawyer, someone who handles cases of family violence, and I'm going to file an official report. But until then, it's important that you stay here, hidden. Do you agree?" Helen agreed, exhausted. Laura stood up, put her notes and camera back in her portfolio, and looked at Betty. "You're doing a very brave thing by protecting Mrs. Carter, but I need you to know there could be consequences. If her family has influence, they might try to make things difficult for you too. Are you sure you want to continue?" Betty didn't hesitate for a second. "I am. I'm not going to abandon this woman. She needs help, and I'm going to give it." Laura smiled, a small but genuine smile, and nodded. "Then we'll do this together." In the days that followed, things began to move quickly. Laura found a lawyer, a middle-aged man named Gerald Miller, known for taking on tough family violence cases. He came to Betty's house, spoke with Helen for hours, took copious notes, studied the photos of her injuries, and left with a grave expression. "This is serious, very serious. If we can prove attempted fraud, coercion and abandonment, the children could face criminal charges. But it won't be easy. They'll deny everything. They'll try to discredit Mrs. Carter. They'll use their resources to drag out the case, but we're going to fight." And the fight began. Gerald filed a police report, attaching the photos, Helen's statement, and the testimony of the boys who had found her in that state. Laura also opened a case with social services, requesting protection for Helen and an investigation into the children's conduct. But as expected, the reaction was swift. 2 days later, the Boston newspapers ran a story about the disappearance of Helen Carter. The article said she suffered from memory problems, had left home disoriented, and that her family was desperately searching for her. There was even an old photo of Helen smiling, alongside her 3 children all in an embrace, the perfect picture of a happy family. Betty read the article and felt her anger rise, but she remained calm. She knew this was part of the children's strategy, to build a narrative that favored them, painting them as worried victims, and Helen as a confused woman who needed to be rescued. But the truth had its own weapons. Gerald, the lawyer, got a court order for Helen to be examined by an independent doctor, someone with no ties to the family. The examination confirmed that she was in full possession of her mental faculties, lucid, coherent, and that the injuries on her body were consistent with her account of the violence she had endured. With this in hand, Gerald filed a lawsuit against Helen's children, accusing them of attempted fraud, coercion, and endangerment. The news reached the children quickly, and their reaction was immediate. The next morning, 3 cars pulled up in front of Betty's house. Out stepped Charles, Renee, and Richard, accompanied by a lawyer and 2 men who looked like security. Charles pounded on the door, and when Betty opened it, he wasted no time on pleasantries. "Where is my mother?" he demanded, his voice loud and authoritarian. Betty looked at him calmly, unintimidated. "If you're talking about Mrs. Carter, she's under protection." "Protection?" Charles took a step forward, but Betty didn't back down. "Protection from whom?" "From some laundress who stuck her nose where it doesn't belong. My mother is sick, confused. She needs proper medical care, not people trying to take advantage of her." Betty felt her anger boil, but she kept her voice steady. "Mrs. Carter is not confused. She is perfectly lucid, and she told us everything you did to her. Everything." Charles opened his mouth to retort, but his sister, Renee, placed a hand on his arm, urging caution. She looked at Betty with a more controlled but no less cold expression. "You don't know anything. My mother has been having delusions, making up stories. She needs treatment, and we, as her children, have the right to care for her." Betty crossed her arms. "Mrs. Carter isn't going anywhere with you. She has a lawyer now, and witnesses. If you want to speak with her, you'll have to do it the right way, in the presence of the authorities." Richard, the youngest, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. There was something dangerous in his eyes. "You have no idea who you're messing with. We have resources, connections. We can make your life very difficult." Betty looked at him without blinking. "You can try, but you won't make me give up." Charles, realizing they were getting nowhere, signaled to the security men who returned to the cars. He gave Betty one last hard look. "This isn't over. We'll see who's telling the truth." And then they left, leaving a trail of menace in the air. Betty closed the door and leaned against it, her heart racing. Matthew and Michael came running from the back of the house where they had been hiding with Helen. "They're gone," Betty said, "but this is far from over." Helen, who had heard everything from her hiding spot, came into the living room, her eyes full of tears. "You don't have to do this for me. You don't have to risk yourselves like this." Betty went to her and held her hands firmly. "Yes, we do. Because it's the right thing to do, and because no one deserves to go through what you went through. We're going to fight, Helen, and we're going to win." But the days that followed proved the fight would be harder than they imagined. Helen's children began spreading rumors around the small town. They said Betty was manipulating a sick woman to get money, that the boys were accomplices, that it was all just an elaborate scam. People who once greeted Betty with respect now looked at her with suspicion. Some of her clients cancelled their laundry service, saying they preferred not to get involved in trouble. The financial pressure began to mount. Betty had some savings, but not much, and with less work things became difficult. But she didn't back down. She continued to care for Helen, ensuring the woman had food, medicine, and comfort. And the boys, despite hearing cruel comments at school, held their heads high. It was Laura who brought the news that changed the course of things. She showed up at the house one afternoon, with the look of someone who had discovered something important. "I've got something. One of Mrs. Carter's neighbors in Boston is willing to give a statement. He said he saw the children leaving the house with their mother that day, and that she looked frightened, like she was trying to resist. He thought it was strange but didn't do anything at the time. Now he's willing to testify." Furthermore, Gerald, the lawyer, had found inconsistencies in the documents the children had prepared. Signatures that didn't match, dates that made no sense, clauses that were clearly detrimental to Helen. Everything pointed to an attempt to force her to sign papers under duress. With this new evidence, the case gained momentum. The police opened a formal investigation, and Helen's children were summoned for questioning. They tried to remain calm, denied everything, but contradictions began to surface. Charles said his mother had been confused for months. Renee said the problems had started just a few weeks ago. Richard claimed there had never been any coercion, but the documents told a different story. And then came the crucial moment. Helen was called to give her testimony. Betty, Laura, and Gerald accompanied her to the police station. The woman was nervous, her hands shaking, but there was determination in her eyes. She was not going to let her children get away with it. The deposition lasted for hours. Helen told everything from the beginning without omitting a single detail. She spoke of how her children had changed, of the veiled threats, of the day she was taken away and abandoned. Her voice broke several times, tears fell, but she didn't stop. She continued to the very end. When she left the station, she was exhausted, but also relieved. For the first time in a long time, she felt that her voice had been heard, that someone finally believed her. Back at Betty's house, Helen sat at the kitchen table and accepted the tea the woman offered her. Matthew and Michael sat beside her in silence, offering only their presence and companionship. And there, in that simple house, in that small kitchen, Helen felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't permanent, but it was there. And that, for now, was enough. The weeks following Helen's deposition were an agonizing wait. The investigation moved slowly, as it often does when influential people are involved. Helen's children hired one of the most expensive lawyers in Boston, a man known for his ability to turn the guilty into victims through well-crafted arguments and legal loopholes. Meanwhile, in Havenwood, life for Betty and the boys had completely changed. The house that was once just theirs now sheltered Helen, and her presence, though initially a source of worry, gradually became natural. Helen helped where she could, folding clean laundry, making tea, telling the boys stories from her youth. There was a gentleness in her that hadn't been broken by her children's cruelty, a kindness that insisted on existing despite everything. Matthew, in particular, had formed a strong bond with Helen. He would spend hours by her side, listening to her stories, asking questions about the past. The woman spoke of the husband she had lost, of what life was like before everything fell apart, of the dreams she'd had and those she still hoped to achieve. and Matthew, with his quiet, observant nature, absorbed it all, occasionally jotting notes in the old notebook he always carried. Michael, for his part, had taken on the role of protector. He kept an eye on anyone passing by on the street, suspicious of any strange movements. He accompanied his grandmother when she went shopping, always alert, always ready to act if something happened. Betty saw in her grandsons a maturity that shouldn't have been there, not at their age, but she also saw strength, and it filled her with pride. One day, Father John came to the house with news. His expression was serious, but there was a glint in his eye that suggested hope. "I have an update. Laura found another witness, a housekeeper who worked for Mrs. Carter for years. She said she always knew the children mistreated their mother, but was afraid to speak up. Now she's willing to testify. And what's more, she has records, text messages, audio clips, things the children said in front of her, thinking a housekeeper was of no consequence." Helen covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes filling with tears. That woman, Joan, had been more than a housekeeper. She was a friend, someone Helen trusted, and knowing she was willing to expose herself to risk her own safety to help was overwhelming. "Joan was always so good to me, always. But I never thought she kept proof. She has a family, children to raise. I don't want her to get hurt because of me." Father John came closer and held Helen's hand gently. "She's doing this because she wants to, Helen. Because she knows it's the right thing to do, and Laura will make sure she has protection. No one will harm her." Helen nodded, but the guilt still weighed on her. She felt responsible for putting so many people at risk, for dragging Betty, the boys, Laura, Gerald, Father John, and now Joan into this battle. But Betty, who had been listening from the kitchen doorway, came in and sat beside her. "Helen, every person helping you is doing so by choice. No one here is a victim. We are allies, and we will fight together until the end." Those words touched Helen deeply. She looked around at that simple house, at the faces of these people who barely knew her, but had become her family, and felt something break inside her. It wasn't a bad thing. It was as if a wall she had built over the years to protect herself from pain was finally crumbling. And behind that wall there was room for hope. The days that followed brought new complications. Helen's children, realizing the case was getting serious, changed their strategy. They stopped denying everything and began to claim it was all a misunderstanding. They said that yes, they had taken their mother for a drive, but that she had gotten out of the car of her own accord, confused, and that they had searched for her desperately. They claimed the marks on her body were from falls, from accidents caused by her own disorientation. It was a well-constructed story, full of details that seemed plausible to anyone who didn't know the truth. And the worst part was, it was working. Some newspapers began to question Helen's version of events, raising doubts about her mental state, about the credibility of her witnesses. Public opinion was divided, and that was dangerous. Gerald, the lawyer, called a meeting at Betty's house. He brought Laura, and the two sat at the kitchen table with Helen, Betty, and Father John. Gerald's expression was tense. "We need something more, something definitive that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Mrs. Carter's children lied. The witnesses are important, so are the documents, but we need something that completely demolishes their version of events." Helen looked down at her own hands, at the marks that were still there, and felt an immense frustration. How was it possible that, after everything she had been through, she still had to prove she was telling the truth? It was Laura who had the idea. She looked at Helen with a thoughtful expression, then at Gerald. "What if we could get access to the children's financial records? If they were planning to take Mrs. Carter's assets, there must be suspicious transactions, preparations, transfers, something that indicates they were getting ready to take control of her estate." Gerald slapped his hand on the table, his eyes lighting up. "That's it, exactly. I'll request a court order to investigate their finances. If we can prove they were making moves to appropriate Mrs. Carter's assets even before she supposedly disappeared, then we'll have something irrefutable." Hope shone in Helen's eyes again, but with it came fear, because she knew that if they messed with her children's money, the reaction would be vicious. And this time she didn't know if they would be prepared to face it. The court order was granted, and the financial records of Helen's 3 children were analyzed. What they found was shocking. Charles had opened an account in his mother's name, but with a forged power of attorney, and had begun transferring significant sums to his personal accounts. Renee had sold some of her mother's assets, claiming authorization, and pocketed the money. Richard had documents prepared to declare his mother incompetent, signed by a doctor who was a family friend and who clearly had not properly examined Helen. It was all there in black and white, a meticulously constructed plan to strip Helen of her assets and silence her forever. Gerald presented the evidence to the judge, and the reaction was immediate. The 3 children were summoned for a hearing, and this time there was no escape. The hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning. Helen was terrified at the thought of seeing her children again, but she knew it was necessary. Betty, Laura, and Gerald would be with her, and that gave her some strength. The night before, she barely slept. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, mentally rehearsing everything she would say, everything she needed to say. Matthew and Michael, sensing the tension, came into her room before bed. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, and Matthew stood beside him, hands in his pockets, a little shy but determined. "We wanted to say something," Michael began, looking at Helen seriously. "We know tomorrow is going to be hard, but you're not alone. We believe in you. Grandma believes in you. Everyone who really knows you believes in you, and that has to count for something." Matthew, more reserved, pulled his old notebook from his pocket and opened it to a marked page. He read in a low voice, almost a whisper. "I wrote this today. It's kind of silly, but I wanted you to hear it. It says, there are things we don't choose. We don't choose the family we're born into. We don't choose the pain we'll carry, but we do choose who will stand by our side when everything seems impossible. And we chose you, because you deserve it." Helen began to cry, but this time they were tears of gratitude. She pulled the 2 boys into a tight hug and held them there, feeling the strength of their small but immense hearts. The next day, the courthouse was packed. Helen entered with Betty, Laura, and Gerald, and felt everyone's eyes on her. On the other side of the room, her 3 children sat with their lawyer. Charles looked at his mother with a hard expression, without a trace of remorse. Renee averted her gaze as if she couldn't face her. Richard sat with his arms crossed, his expression indifferent. The judge, a middle-aged man with graying hair and round glasses, entered, and everyone rose. He sat, adjusted the papers on his desk, and began the session. The hearing lasted for hours. Gerald presented all the evidence, one piece at a time. He showed the photos of Helen's injuries, the witness statements, the financial records that proved the attempted fraud. The children's lawyer tried to counter, claiming it was all a misinterpretation, that the children were merely looking after their mother's interests, that the financial transfers were legitimate. But when it was Helen's turn to speak, everything changed. She stood up, her hands trembling, but her voice was firm. She looked directly at her children and began to speak. "I gave you everything. I worked my whole life so you could have what I never had. I paid for your schools, your colleges, helped you when you were in trouble. I was always there. And when I needed you, when I was alone after your father passed, you abandoned me. Worse than that, you betrayed me. You treated me like I was nothing, like my life had no value. And why? For money, for assets, for things that will never bring anyone happiness." Her voice faltered, but she continued. "You tied me up. You left me in a cemetery, hoping I would die there. And if it weren't for 2 boys, 2 poor, orphan boys who had more compassion than my own children, I wouldn't be here today. They saved me. They and a woman who barely knew me, but who took me in, protected me, risked everything for me. And you, my children, my own children, threw me away like trash." Helen looked at the judge, tears now streaming freely. "I don't want revenge. I want justice. I want them to answer for what they did, and I want this to be an example so that no other elderly person has to go through what I went through." The silence in the room was absolute. Even the children's lawyer seemed speechless. The judge looked at Charles, Renee, and Richard and asked if they had anything to say. Charles opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Renee began to cry, but it wasn't the cry of remorse, it was the cry of someone who had been caught. Richard just shook his head, saying he had nothing to declare. The judge then rose and said he would review all the evidence and deliver his verdict soon. The hearing was adjourned, and Helen left exhausted but also relieved. She had said everything she needed to say. She had looked her children in the eye and shown them she was no longer the fragile woman they thought they could control. Back in Havenwood, Helen sat in the backyard of Betty's house, looking at the sky as it began to darken. The boys were playing with the neighbor's dog, and Betty was in the kitchen making dinner. It was a simple, everyday scene, but to Helen it was everything. It was peace, it was safety, it was love. That night, as they all ate dinner together around the table, Helen asked a question she had been pondering for days. "Betty, why did you do it? Why did you risk everything for me, a stranger?" Betty stopped eating, looked at Helen with those eyes full of wisdom, and answered simply, "Because it was the right thing to do, and because no one, absolutely no one, deserves to be treated the way they treated you. If each of us does a little, the world becomes a less cruel place. It's as simple as that." Helen smiled, a rare thing lately, and nodded. It was as simple as that. And in that simplicity there was a profound beauty, something she had forgotten existed. The days that followed were a waiting game, but this time it was a different kind of waiting. It was no longer that paralyzing anguish. It was anticipation, the feeling that finally the truth was coming to light, and that no matter what happened, Helen knew she was no longer alone. And then, one morning, the phone rang. It was Gerald. The judge had delivered his verdict. Helen's children would be held accountable. They would have to return everything they had taken from her. They would face criminal charges for attempted fraud and coercion, and they would be subject to protective orders, preventing them from approaching their mother. Helen listened in silence, and when she hung up the phone, she stood still for a moment, processing. Then, slowly, a smile began to form. It wasn't a smile of victory, it was a smile of relief, of liberation. After carrying that weight for so long, she could finally breathe. Betty and the boys celebrated, but in a restrained, respectful way. They knew this didn't erase the pain Helen had felt, but it was a step, an important step toward healing. That evening, Helen asked to go to the cemetery. Betty found it strange, but went with her, along with the boys. When they reached the place where it had all begun, the wall where the boys had found her, Helen stopped and took a deep breath. "This is where I died, and this is where I was reborn, thanks to you." She turned to Matthew and Michael and held both their hands. "You saved me, in a way that goes beyond the physical. You gave me back my faith in humanity, and for that, I will be eternally grateful." Matthew, always quiet, looked at Helen and said voice firm, "We just did what was right, like Grandma always taught us." And in that moment there in that fog-covered cemetery, as the cold wind blew and the stars began to appear in the sky, Helen understood that family isn't just about blood. Family is who stands by your side when the world falls apart. It's who catches you when you fall. It's who believes in you when no one else does. And she had found that here, in that small house in the lowlands, with these simple, generous people who had changed her life forever. The months following, the verdict were a time of quiet but profound transformation. Helen, who had lived for so long in the shadow of fear and betrayal, began to rebuild herself. It wasn't a quick or easy process. There were days when the weight of the past returned with force, days when the nightmares came back and she would wake in a panic, searching for imaginary ropes around her wrists. But slowly, with the help of Betty, the boys, and the entire support network that had formed around her, she found the strength to move forward. The first major decision Helen made was not to return to Boston. Her old house, the place that had once been a home, was now stained with painful memories. Besides, her children, though convicted and forbidden from approaching her, still lived in the city, and their presence, even from a distance, was a ghost Helen no longer wanted to carry. So she decided to stay in Havenwood, close to the people who truly cared about her. With part of the resources she managed to recover, Helen bought a simple little house in the Lowlands neighborhood, just a few blocks from Betty's. It was nothing luxurious, but it was hers, earned with dignity, a symbol of a new beginning. The house had a small yard where she started planting flowers, the same wildflowers the boys had taken to their mother's grave on that foggy morning that changed everything. Daisies, black-eyed Susans, and roses that insisted on blooming even in the Vermont chill. Betty helped Helen get settled, bringing over used but still good furniture, curtains she had sewn herself, and even a few simple pictures to brighten the walls. The boys pitched in too, carrying boxes, painting walls, and organizing everything with a care that revealed the affection. They felt for this woman who had, in a way, become part of their family. When everything was ready, Helen invited everyone for dinner. It was the first time she had cooked in her new home, and she prepared a hearty meal full of classic American comfort foods she had learned to make over a lifetime. There was roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, gravy, and an apple pie that came out of the oven perfuming the whole house. Betty, Matthew, Michael, Father John, Laura, Gerald, and even Joan, the former housekeeper who had testified for Helen, were all there, gathered around the table. It was a night of gratitude and joy. Conversations flowed naturally, interspersed with laughter and stories. Helen looked around at those faces and felt her heart overflow. These people, from different places, with different stories, had united for a common cause, the pursuit of justice and human dignity. And now, here they were, no longer as allies in a battle, but as family. When dessert was served, Helen stood up and asked for everyone's attention. Her voice, which months ago was just a faint whisper, now sounded firm and full of emotion. I want to thank each and every one of you. I don't have the words to express what you've done for me. You gave me back my life, my dignity, my hope. And more than that, you showed me that there is still goodness in the world, even when all seems lost. I was ready to give up, to accept that my life no longer had value. But you proved me wrong. And for that, I will be eternally grateful. There were tears, hugs, and a respectful silence that said more than any words could. Betty, ever wise, raised her coffee cup and made a simple but profound toast. May we never forget that love is stronger than any hate, and that compassion is the most powerful weapon we have. Everyone raised their cups and repeated the words, sealing that moment as something to be cherished forever. As the months went by, Helen became more and more integrated into the Havenwood community. She started attending church, where Father John always welcomed her with a warm smile. She participated in services, community events, and was gradually recognized not as the woman who was the victim of a tragedy, but as someone who had overcome it and was now willing to help others. That's when the idea for the community project came up. One afternoon, while talking with Laura, Helen mentioned that she wanted to do something to give back for everything she had received. Laura, always practical and full of ideas, suggested they create a support center for vulnerable senior women, a place where they could find shelter, legal guidance, psychological support, and a network of protection. Helen loved the idea and dedicated herself heart and soul to making it a reality. With part of her resources, she rented a small property in the center of town and, with the help of Laura, Betty, and several volunteers, transformed the space into a refuge for women going through situations similar to her own. The center offered everything from counseling with social workers to craft workshops, support groups, and even literacy classes for those who never had the chance to study. Matthew and Michael also got involved in the project. Matthew, who had always loved to write, started teaching a writing class for some of the women, helping them write letters, documents, and even short stories about their lives. Michael, more active, organized recreational activities, helped with logistics, and became a sort of messenger, running errands and keeping everyone connected. The center quickly gained recognition. Local newspapers published articles about the project, highlighting Helen's story and the importance of the work. Some businesses began to make donations, and the community rallied to help. What started as a small dream of a woman who wanted to repay the kindness she received turned into something much larger, impacting dozens of lives. One of the women who came to the center months later was Dorothy, a 70-year-old woman who had been kicked out of her home by her own son after her husband passed away. She arrived scared, with nowhere to go, no money and no hope. Helen welcomed her personally, and upon hearing Dorothy's story, she saw a reflection of herself. She took the woman in with kindness, offered temporary shelter, and began working with Laura to resolve her situation. Over time, Dorothy grew stronger, secured a pension she was entitled to, but that her son had hidden from her, and began to rebuild her life. Months later, she became a volunteer at the center herself, helping other women who arrived in the same situation she had been. And it was by seeing stories like Dorothy's that Helen understood the true meaning of her own journey. She hadn't been saved just to live in peace. She had been saved to be an instrument of salvation for others. And that gave her life a new purpose, a purpose that went far beyond herself. Meanwhile, the relationship between Helen and Betty's family continued to strengthen. Matthew and Michael spent almost every day at her house, helping with whatever was needed, but also just to be near, to talk, to share their daily lives. Helen became a mother figure to them, filling a void that the loss of their own mother had left. Not that she replaced their mother, that was impossible, but she occupied a new space, equally important and full of love. Matthew, who had always been reserved, began to open up more. He showed Helen some of the things he wrote, poems and reflections that were profound for someone so young. She encouraged him, praised him, and even suggested he try to publish some of his writings in local papers. Over time, Matthew gained confidence and his pieces began to appear in small columns, always on themes of hope, resilience, and love for one's neighbor. Michael, for his part, discovered a talent for working with people. He was charismatic, funny, and had an incredible ability to make anyone feel welcome. Helen saw in him a potential leader, someone who could make a big difference in the world if given the right opportunities, and she was determined to help him reach that potential. With Helen's support, Michael got a scholarship to a private school in Havenwood, something Betty could never have afforded. And Matthew, at Helen's insistence, was also enrolled in the same school, ensuring the two would stay together, supporting each other. Education, Helen knew, was the key to a better future, and she was committed to making sure those boys had every chance she could provide. Betty, watching all of this from a distance, felt a mix of pride and gratitude. Her life had never been easy, always struggling to get by, always carrying the weight of raising her grandsons alone. But now, with Helen there, sharing the responsibilities, offering support, everything felt lighter. And more than that, she had gained a friend, a true sister of the heart, someone she could count on in tough times and celebrate with in good times. The two women, so different in their origins but so similar in their essence, formed a bond that went beyond the circumstances that brought them together. They had coffee together every morning, talked about everything and nothing, laughed at the little things in life and supported each other whenever sadness or longing appeared. One day, as they sat in Helen's yard, watching the boys play with the dog, Betty asked a question she had been pondering for some time. "Helen, have you ever thought about forgiving your children?" Helen was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the flowers swaying in the wind. Then, in a calm voice laden with emotion, she answered, "Forgiving doesn't mean forgetting, Betty, and it doesn't mean trusting again. I have forgiven them, yes, because holding on to resentment would only hurt me more. But that doesn't change what they did. They chose their path and I chose mine. And my path is here with you, with the people who truly care about me. As for them, I hope they find peace one day, but that's no longer up to me." Betty nodded, understanding perfectly. Forgiveness is a personal process, and everyone deals with it in their own way. What mattered was that Helen had found peace, and that was all that mattered. The years passed, and life in Havenwood continued its quiet but meaningful rhythm. Matthew graduated from high school with honors, won a full scholarship to study journalism at a state university, and became a respected writer, always tackling themes of social justice and human rights. Michael, meanwhile, dedicated himself to social work, following in Laura's footsteps, and became a tireless advocate for causes related to the elderly and children in vulnerable situations. Betty continued to take in laundry, but now with less financial pressure, as Helen always made sure to help. The two women grew old together, side by side, sharing joys and sorrows, celebrating achievements and facing challenges. The support center Helen created expanded, gaining statewide and even national recognition. Other cities began to replicate the model, creating their own protection networks for elderly women. And it had all started there, in that small historic town, with the courage of a woman who refused to accept injustice and the compassion of simple people who saw beyond appearances. On a special day, 10 years after that foggy morning, in the cemetery, Helen organized a ceremony at the support center. It was to honor all the people who had been part of her journey of rebuilding. Betty, now with completely white hair but still strong and full of energy, was there. Matthew and Michael, now grown men, were also present. Father John, Laura, Gerald, Joan, and so many others who had been touched by that story. Helen took the small makeshift stage and, in an emotional voice, began to speak. 10 years ago, I was lost. I thought my life was over, that I had no more value, that no one cared. But then 2 boys found me. 2 boys who had nothing but who had everything that truly matters, a pure heart and the courage to do what is right. They saved me. And from that moment on, many other people came into my life and showed me that goodness still exists, that compassion still exists, that love still exists. She looked directly at Matthew and Michael, who were in the front row, their eyes shining. You taught me that family isn't blood. It's a choice. It's being present. It's loving without expecting anything in return. And I chose you, and you chose me. And that made all the difference. There was applause, tears, hugs. And in that moment, everyone there understood that this story wasn't just about tragedy and survival. It was about the strength of human bonds, about our ability to transform pain into love, to turn suffering into purpose. At the end of the ceremony, Helen asked everyone to walk to the cemetery, the place where it had all begun. It was a symbolic walk, a return to the starting point, but now with a completely different meaning. When they reached the wall where the boys had found her, Helen knelt and planted a rosebush. It was a symbol of life being born where there had once been only pain. "This is the place where I died," she said, her voice firm, "but it is also the place where I was reborn. And now this rose will grow here, reminding everyone that even in the darkest of places, life can flourish." The years continued to pass, and Helen lived a full life, surrounded by love and purpose. When her time came to leave, many years later, it was peacefully in her own bed with Betty, with holding one of her hands and Matthew and Michael holding the other. Her last words were of gratitude, of love, of hope. "Thank you for everything. You gave me my life back, and I lived. I truly lived." Helen's funeral was simple, as she had requested, but the cemetery was full. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects. Women who had been helped by the support center, volunteers, friends, neighbors, all united by the same gratitude. And on her grave, next to the rose bush she herself had planted years ago, Matthew placed a plaque with a phrase he had written especially for her. "Here lies Helen Carter, who taught us that love always wins." Betty, now over 80, stood before the grave for a long time in silence. Then, with a choked voice, she murmured a final farewell. "Go in peace, my friend. You fulfilled your mission, and we will continue what you started." And so it was. The support center continued to operate, now managed by Michael, with Matthew writing stories about the women who were helped, spreading the message of hope and dignity. Helen's legacy was secure, not in material possessions, but in transformed lives, in touched hearts, in saved souls. Years later, Matthew wrote a book telling the whole story, from that foggy morning in the cemetery to Helen's final days. The book became a bestseller, not because it was an incredible story, but because it was a true story, a story of redemption, of compassion, of unconditional love. And people needed to hear stories like that. They needed to believe that even when all seems lost, there is still hope. The story of Helen, Betty, Matthew, and Michael became etched in the memory of Havenwood. It became a legend, an inspiration, proof that small acts of kindness can change the course of entire lives. And whenever someone passed by the cemetery and saw that blooming rosebush, they remembered that there, in that place of memories and farewells, a story of love and new beginnings had also been born. Because in the end we are all saved by someone at some point in our lives, and we all have the power to save someone too. All it takes is eyes to see, a heart to feel, and the courage to act.